They called the sheriff on me on my own land, and Brenda Vance stood there like a woman auditioning for Judgment Day clipboard, held high lips, painted with the kind of smile that could be sold as a weapon, while red and blue strobes painted the porch in holy and unholy colors. I remember thinking very calmly in that tight little moment before the absurdity hit the deputies who actually calls for an arrest to repossess a memory. Then I blinked and remembered this was never about law or order. It was about territory. And Brenda had been playing land grab chess for years with other people's lives as pawns. My name's Arthur Pendleton. And 4 months before I found myself explaining to a deputy why the dirt under my boots was mine. I was the kind of burned-out corporate lifer who believed silence was a currency you could cash in once you left the city. 30 years of conferences, mergers, and divorce papers finally taught me what my grandfather already knew. Some pieces of earth hold a kind of quiet you can't buy in Chicago townhouses. So I packed what was left of myself into a beat-up pickup, drove back to the 50-acre slice of Montana my grandfather left me, and thought I was done with paperwork and petty people. I was wrong. That ranch, the porch with the squeaky screen door, the barn smelling of old saddle leather and hay, the way the Bridger Peaks bled gold at sunrise, it felt like coming home to a hymn. I learned to listen again to crows arguing on the ridge, to the wind, making promises through pine needles, to the small, honest clink of tools being put away at dusk. I wasn't rebuilding a life so much as tuning a battered radio until a clear station came through. Then Brenda Vance moved her pastel empire to the valley and decided my song didn't fit her playlist. Brenda was a type of woman who weaponized nice, a bob haircut, soft pastels, a sterling SUV with gold decaled compliance badges, and a voice that could make outrage sound like a virtue. She had convinced half the county that neat hedges equaled salvation, and she'd convinced the other half that litigation could pay for a fountain. Whispering Pines' enclave sprang up like an infection in the valley. An architectural fever dream of identical facades and bankrolled politics, and Brenda strangled anything that didn't smell of citrus-scented HOA newsletters. Gardeners disappeared. Mailboxes were fined into conformity. People who grew tomatoes because they needed to eat were treated like aesthetic criminals. The first crack in this polite facade came on a Tuesday morning when I found Brenda's crew tearing up the cedar posts my grandfather had hammered in, back when a man could be measured by the fences he kept. It was slow-motion desecration, wood splintering gravel, spitting like shrapnel, her clipboard, a talisman of entitlement. She told me with that practiced casual cruelty that municipal codes had changed, that progress required a 30-foot buffer between her mint lawns and my agricultural eyesore. She smiled while the men pulled up a monument to my family's history, and in that smile I saw the entire plan: wear the old folks down, milk the reserve accounts, build condos, and call it rejuvenation. I could have cracked. Plenty of people cracked. Mrs. Nakamura, who lived next door, had her vegetable beds tagged as poverty-inducing blight. Mr. Higgins, a Desert Storm veteran, got threatened with foreclosure for parking a camper on land he'd owned for decades. Brenda's playbook was textbook authoritarian, petty weaponized bylaws: aim them at the vulnerable, bleed them until they surrender. But I'd spent my life auditing crooks, tracking ghost invoices, ripping apart balance sheets to find the marrow of a scam. I knew how to read a ledger the way other people read the weather, and what I learned in those fluorescent offices came back to me like ammunition. So I did something Brenda never expected. I asked for her paperwork. Not in a hand-it-over kind of way, but with the slow, cold curiosity of someone who'd spent his career watching empires topple under the weight of their own fraud. That night I made the barn a war room. I brewed espresso, pulled up encrypted feeds, and let Nemesis Management Dynamics, the firm I'd quietly built years back and then walked away from, do the heavy lifting. There's a dark, satisfying art to trawling through municipal databases, the mistakes people make when they assume no one's looking. And people like Brenda, who laundered small-town pettiness through corporate shell games, make mistakes that glow like beacons. The first gleaming error was an environmental one. Their clubhouse had been built over a protected aquifer, and the paperwork conveniently omitted that tiny little fact. That was the kind of federal hole you can drive a bulldozer through. The second was even sweeter. The stone-pillared entrance to Whispering Pines sat in living, arrogant stone 4 feet over my property line. Hostile encroachment, a bulldozer's legal invitation. The math of it was brutal. One misfiled survey, one lapsed corporate charter, and an HOA's entire extortion racket collapses like a house of cards when someone breathes on it. Then the twist, and yes, the moment movies call for, when the whole plot flips like a coin, exposing a different face. Brenda tried to manufacture a boundary dispute, hired an unlicensed surveyor to reconfirm lines, and his gang accidentally uncovered a 1920s iron monument my grandfather's generation had set in the ground, the kind of artifact that, legal clerk or not, means your new lines are nonsense. But the real twist was messier and darker in her arrogance. She had her HOA's corporate charter lapse. The HOA, the teeth behind her threats, legally didn't exist. Every fine she'd levied, every lien she'd placed, every threat was built on a house of non-existence. At this point, the valley changed from a place to live into a battlefield. People stopped whispering and started printing. Mr. Higgins produced receipts that read like ransom notes from Brenda's mini fiefdom. Mrs. Nakamura brought me a tray of pastries and a stack of notices that made my skin crawl, the slow, systematic way a woman could be stripped of her home by a committee's handwriting. We organized barbecues that were really clandestine intelligence meetings. Neighbors who once nodded politely now uncorked shoeboxes of evidence. My barn became the county's least likely command center, flowcharts on the walls, surveillance logs with timestamps, bank statements that tasted like betrayal. Brenda escalated, of course. In desperation, she filed for a restraining order, painted me as a dangerous cowboy in front of a judge, and in her theatrical haste, she made the mistake that costs narcissists everything. She lied under oath. A judge with an attention span for nonsense and a stack of deeds, surveillance logs, and federal complaints saw her for what she was. The restraining order evaporated in open court. Her weeping looked like a performance, and the judge didn't buy a single ticket. But the real downfall was in the mailbox. She'd tried to reroute HOA correspondence through my address to intercept litigation. Instead, a sealed bank statement with $190,000 worth of phantom contractor invoices landed in my hands like a confession. I called Elena Rostova, a former FBI financial crimes specialist, who loves a forensic trail the way some people love a puzzle. She arrived with a team, and what followed was a slow, precise excavation of Brenda's ledger shell companies, fake hail claims, phantom invoices that had drained community reserves into a private LLC registered in her name. The color left her face when we showed the detective the wire trails. The handcuffs were almost anticlimactic in their click. There's a rare particular music to watching the tyrant being led away. The clack of metal, the shuffle of feet. The way neighbors stepped out onto porches with eyes wet and mouths open like the world had righted itself, and they were all bearing witness. Brenda screamed about conspiracies and deep states, which, if you listen to the way some people squeal when cornered, is just background noise. Her brother-in-law, the local commissioner who had rubber-stamped every ugly move, scrambled to distance himself, and the political canopy she enjoyed vanished like a cheap tent in a storm. The courtroom was cinematic. I took the podium at a packed emergency meeting and, without theatrics, displayed the evidence, every illicit wire, every forged invoice plain as day on a giant screen. The gymnasium smelled like damp coats and victory and the strange salt of communal relief. 6 months later, the valley heals. Mrs. Nakamura teaches her recipes to kids who don't remember the fear. Mr. Higgins parks his camper without hunching over forms, and the barn hosts potlucks that sound like music in the evenings. Brenda sits where she belongs, behind bars on a 5-year sentence for interstate fraud and extortion, and the funds she looted have been clawed back and returned, every penny accounted for. Just as slow as a winter thaw arrived, and it felt like sunlight on cold hands. If there's a moral here, it didn't come from me waving a flag of righteousness. It arrived like a splintering realization in the quiet after the sirens that systems designed to protect can be turned into weapons that power accrues in small, incremental cruelties until people are too broke or too scared to fight, and that ordinary decency is preserved not by one hero, but by neighbors who decide together they won't be bullied. I also learned that sometimes to protect what you love, you have to weaponize the very skills you thought you'd buried. The man who wanted silence had to make noise so loud it could be heard in every county office and on every recorder. And there's a darker question that sits in the dust after the cameras leave in a society that worships uniformity and curb appeal. Where exactly do we draw the line between community standards and weaponized surveillance? When law becomes an instrument for personal vendettas, do we rely on courts, on journalists, on board auditors with too much time and a knack for spreadsheets, or do we occasionally have to play the monster? The monster has become to unmake it. So tell me, where do you stand? When keeping up appearances becomes a method of theft and intimidation, does the end justify the means? Drop a comment with your take, tell a story. If you lived through something similar, and if this lit a fire in you, share it with someone who still believes that a tidy hedge equals civilized society. If you like this hit, like, subscribe for more, and let's keep the conversation going. What would you have done if they came for your fence, your mailbox, or your grandma's garden?
Cảm ơn các bạn đã xem video.